From the Big Bang Theory to the creationless view of this planet. From the stars and moons and all the galaxies to where did humanity get its origins? Who is Jesus? And is he really God? And who are the angels? Do demons really exist? And if so, what are they? Really? I'm James. And this is Kenner. And this is Double-Minded Conversations Down the Rabbit Hole. Good afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you're watching this. Welcome back to Double-Minded Conversations Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm James.
I'm Kenner.
I'm Nick.
And all three of us, we welcome you back. It's been a couple of weeks since we last did a live stream. We had some scheduling mix-up around the Mother's Day holiday, so we didn't go live that weekend. And then actually the very next day, after Mother's Day, I had dental surgery. And following that week, I just didn't feel up to, doing the live stream. You can probably still tell. So
it's James's fault. Is what he's basically saying.
you can probably still tell that, I'm speaking a little bit funny, maybe.
Sounds great.
Well, thank you. But I feel like I sound like I got cotton in my mouth for one. But I'm praying to God that I have a quick and speedy recovery, and I get my speech back the way that I like speaking, because this way I have to admit kind of sucks right now. So
You sound fine, James.
well, thank you.
Good to have you back.
So the last time that we did go live, we started the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we were talking about the Essenes, which is a Jewish sect that lived out in the deserts of Qumran and are ascribed to writing the scrolls. So I believe you had something that you
before we do a little brief recap, I want to do a correction because I think it's really important to correct things that we find that are that weren't as accurate as we thought they were at the time. I had mentioned in a previous show, I forget which episode it was, but that said that there are lots of similarities between the way the Essenes ran their group, and compared that to how the disciples, with Jesus being the leader, and he had 12 disciples, and he had 3 of his inner circle. And the information that I was reading, I didn't do my due diligence, and it wasn't applied, although there are similarities, lots of similarities between the two. This one in particular only applies to the end times, because the Essenes were an apocalyptic group waiting for the end time to come. And at the end time, they were going to nominate a high priest and have 12 people under him that represented the 12 tribes of Judah. So it wasn't necessarily how they ran things from a day-to-day standpoint. It was more of an apocalyptic viewpoint. I just wanted to clear that up. But a brief recap, like James said, the Essenes were a group that were at odds with the Sadducees and Pharisees. They didn't believe that the high priest was actually supposed to be the high priest, because it's supposed to be a Levite, right? They're all priests.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually, I think it was Joachim, the Essenes actually had one of the descendants of Aaron as their high priest. Right? Yeah. And I just want to clear that up. And we've got a bunch of things to go over today. Do you want to kick us off?
Oh, yeah. Let's get started. All All right. So if you're heading out of Jerusalem eastward into the Judean desert, you're going to find the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea is about 300 meters or about 1,312 feet below sea level. It's the lowest place on the surface of the earth. And what we're talking about as you're traveling through this Judean desert, it's actually about 43 kilometers from Jerusalem, and that's about 27 miles. So like you can easily do it. Like walking, I think it's about 7 hours walking. Maybe an hour driving from Jerusalem out into this spot. Um, the Dead Sea itself is 50 kilometers long. It's about 15 kilometers wide and about 400 meters in depth, and it covers about 605 square kilometers. Virtually all the water flows into it from the Jordan River from the north. In Hebrew, it's called the Sea of Salt, making it the world's saltiest body of water. It's 10 times more saltier than the sea. Water is about a third of it is salt and other minerals. And what I found so wild is that, like, you can sit there and, well, you can lay there and float without like sinking at all. You can sit there and read a book or a newspaper or whatnot, and you will never ever sink. That's how much salt and buoyancy this water has. The Dead Sea, over the years, has attracted visitors, actually thousands of years. It was one of the world's first health resorts for Herod the Great. Um, let's see, it supplies a variety of products like asphalt for Egyptian mummification, to potash, to fertilizers. Um, the salt minerals from the sea are also used in cosmetics and herbal sachets.
What was
Um,
that last one?
uh, the minerals, the salt from
Sachets?
the sachets, like bags.
Oh, okay. Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. I didn't know that.
yeah. So it rarely rains, and the summer temps can reach about 45 degrees Celsius or 113 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty hot, and that's in the summer. It's very harsh and inhospitable. Now, near the northwestern shore at sea, in the wilderness, is the hillside that is honeycombed with caves. And this is the site of the most exciting discovery of all time, at least in modern history.
Absolutely.
Because in it lies the treasure most valuable than all of the gold and wealth found in the ancient tombs of kings and pharaohs. And guess what? It happened by accident. So picture it. Sicily, 1949. But really, picture it. 1947, Qumran. A Bedouin boy by the name of Mohammed the Wolf was minding his goats near the cliffs along the shores of this Dead Sea. Now, these goats are agile, they're able to climb great heights, and they're looking for like these sporadic green tufts of grass that grow in the springtime and like all over this desert region. So, one of his goats strayed away from the flock and he's searching for this goat and he comes across a cave in the cliffs that he's never noticed before, right? So he's like, maybe, his goat took refuge in that cave to get out of the sun to escape the heat. So he picks up the stone and he chucks it into that cave. And instead of hearing the stone against stone, he hears the echo of shattering pottery and he runs away in fear. So this Mohammed the Wolf, he belonged to a group of Bedouin smugglers from the Tamara tribe. Tamara tribe, yes. And they were trying to get their livestock and other goods out of Jordan into Palestine. So they're on their way to Bethlehem to sell their goods on the black market. They decided to take a detour far south to the northern shores of the Dead Sea to avoid crossing the Jordan Bridge because there's custom officers and they've got guns. So they set up camp at Now, I'm going to butcher this name. It's called Ain Fashka. I believe that's how you pronounce it.
Close enough.
Ain Fashka. And it's a desert oasis near the ancient ruins at Qumran. Now, that night, in his family's tent, he tells his cousin about what happened near the cave. And the boys were intrigued, you know, about what was in the cave. So the next morning, they got up, they went to the cave, they slipped through the narrow opening and dropped into the cave. So what did they find? Well, they found large dusty clay pots standing on the floor of the cave. So they, you know, removed the lid. They were curious. They removed the lid, and they were actually disappointed to find the jars contained rolled up old leather pieces, and they were covered in strange writing, carefully wrapped in other cloth, and it's blackened by age. Um, Hoping to find the treasure of gold and silver, they actually found brittle old scrolls, and that wasn't very much used for anything, they thought. But of course, they did find treasure, right? They just didn't know. So the treasure that they found, we now know as the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
So what did they do? They scooped up the scrolls, they put them in their shirts, and they took them back to the camp. And thinking that they can get a little bit of money or whatnot for them, they wanted to take it back to Bethlehem. And over the next few weeks, the boys actually found like four more scrolls and a couple of unbroken jars. The scrolls hung from their tent poles in their Bedouin camp over the next few months, actually. And eventually, they took the scrolls and two jars to a shopkeeper friend in Bethlehem. His name was Kando. Um, at first, no one wanted the scrolls. I think an antiquities dealer even said that they were worthless. You know, everyone said them to be worthless. But Kando decided to buy four of the scrolls. He thought if nothing else, they could be used elsewhere, like leather for shoe repair. So the three remaining scrolls were sold to an antiquities dealer named Salahi. Now, Kando resold his four scrolls to Archbishop Samuel, and he was the head of the Syrian Orthodox monastery of St. Mark's in Jerusalem. So, a Hebrew university professor by the name of Eleazar Stefanik heard about the scrolls and went to investigate the significance of them. Now, this at this time it was extremely dangerous because the Arab Jewish tensions were high as the modern state of Israel was emerging. Remember, this was back in 1947. But apparently, that didn't bother Sukunik. He was willing to risk anything and everything. So here's where it gets crazy. He goes to meet this antiquities dealer at the British divided military zone on the Jerusalem border. So the dealer holds up a fragment of leather for the professor to examine, and this is all through like barbed wire, actually. So he's examining this piece of this fragment of the scroll, and he recognized the ancient Hebrew writing on it. He wanted to see more. He traveled with that dealer to the Arab Bethlehem to Salahi, who had the first three scrolls. And of course, he was amazed and he purchased all three of them. And it was the first time the scrolls had been read in 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. So, as the tensions and the region burst into war, the archbishop smuggled the four remaining scrolls from Jerusalem to America, actually, where he advertised them in the Wall Street Journal and in a classified ad. Well, in a weird, strange twist of fate, the professor's son, I can't pronounce that name, so I'll just say the professor's son, Sukunik, he was a war hero, an Israeli war hero. He bought all four of those scrolls. So the first seven of the original scrolls were reunited again back in Israel. Now, when the news reached the Bedouins and their friends that the scrolls were actually valuable, hundreds of them, they treasure hunters basically, rushed to the area um, near the Dead Sea. They were searching everywhere that they could to find more of these scrolls. In about 10 new caves, they found the remains of nine 500 scrolls. One cave alone, that's cave 4, had 500 scrolls hidden in it. And most of the scrolls, yes, have been broken into smaller little pieces, but altogether, 40,000. Not 4,000, not 400. 40,000 pieces came from cave 4 alone. Now, each one had to be bought by the Arab who found them, and it was bought at an average price of about $4 per square centimeter. So the thousands of fragments were brought to the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, laid out in the courtyard, and sorted. Then specialists began this long and tedious task of piecing the scrolls back together and deciphering their strange writing. And it was an ancient form of Hebrew. Archaeologists returned to the shoreline and re-explored the area. They found a cave that contained an unusual scroll. Now, this scroll in particular was 3 strips of finely beaten copper that had been inscribed and rolled up into a scroll. And as they searched the caves, they found more fragments. They realized these scrolls had been a part of a large library. About 100 meters from this cave 4, they found the largest cache of small fragments and some old ruins that had actually these ruins had actually been on a map for decades. And these ruins were mistakenly assumed to be an old Roman uh, camp or fort. But the archaeologists did some excavating and revealing that the ruins had been a monastery of the Jewish sect around the time of Jesus, the Essenes, which we talked about last time. And these ruins were where they lived in seclusion, copying out the Bible and other texts. So, in the June of 68 AD, the writing and the copying here in the ruins, in those ruins of Qumran, had stopped forever. During the first Jewish revolt against Rome, on the way to attack Jerusalem, the Roman armies destroyed the Essene settlement at Qumran. The ones that could escape had just enough time to hide the scrolls in those caves in the nearby cliffside before they fled from the Romans, probably hoping that after the Romans were gone, these scrolls could be rescued. Um, some some of the scrolls perished to landslides or dampness, but many survived and laid undisturbed in the desert caves for almost 2,000 years before becoming the greatest manuscript discovery in history. And I would have to agree with that too.
Yeah, I'd say Nagamati is probably a close second.
Yeah. The majority of the scrolls were biblical manuscripts, copies of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. All of the books, except for the book of Esther, were found, and a whole Isaiah scroll. This is important because up until 1947, the oldest manuscript we had came from the 9th century. And if you think about the timeline, that's a long way off, right? But as the scrolls were studied and examined, they were confirmed to be written before or at the time of Jesus, making them 1,000 years older than any complete biblical manuscript in existence. Compared to the words of our Bible today, they were actually virtually identical. This means that we can know that our Bible today is virtually the same as it was when it came out of the hands of the prophets.
The Old
This means,
Testament.
this means we can trust the Bible to virtually say what it was written by the prophets to say. So, all in all, this is what they found. They found biblical text, pseudo-apocryphal text, and apocryphal text, and sectarian text. Um, all books of the Old Testament, excluding Esther, like I said, an entire copy of the book of Isaiah, and that dates back to 125 BC, before Jesus. Um, Apocryphal text, and the apocrypha, it only means hidden. So these hidden texts that, if you don't know what the apocryphal is, just do a quick Google search. It's basically hidden text that the Catholic Bible uses. The pseudo apocryphal texts are basically 2 words. You got pseudo, which is fake or false, and apocryphal, which is inscription. So it's fake or false inscriptions, and these are texts they were ascribed to a certain author, but that author didn't write them. The text is actually dated far after this person had died. And some examples are like the Odes of Solomon, the Book of Enoch, the Testament of Abraham. And there were also sectarian writings unique to this Essene community were found at Qumran. And we touched briefly about that last time. We're going to go into deeper detail on this one about some of these texts, but that includes their community rule, the Damascus document, and the Messianic rule. Now, I told you about that copper scroll, right? So that copper scroll is actually, this is the fun part, is actually a treasure map where apparently 61 hoards of gold, silver, and incense and things of the like are hidden in secret places and in the near the Dead Sea in Jerusalem, and hasn't been found. So that's about 200 tons worth of gold, silver, incense, stuff like that, and it's worth over $1 billion, and it hasn't been found. So um, I would love to go over there and try to find this treasure. Um, is there a significance of Isaiah being the only full copy of the text? I kind of think so. That's where I'm going with this. So we're going to get into some more conversation, but I just find it fascinating that of all that they found over the 900 scrolls, that the book of Isaiah is the only one that's complete and intact. So, and another thing that strikes me odd about this is that um, so these Essenes, they were copying the Bible and their text up until the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and no one saw these scrolls in all that time into 1947 with the reemergence of the Israeli nation, of the Israel nation. And I find that very, very, very interesting. So that's pretty much all that
That was an awesome introduction into the Dead Sea Scrolls. A couple things that's come about of late. They actually did find a fragment of Esther in the caves. They actually did find one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is a recent discovery.
Oh, wow.
And the copper scroll, some were claiming that to be King Solomon's treasure that was moved along with the ark and etc. So there's some are saying that the ark could actually be part of it too. Now you brought up something that was interesting. I thought the Testament of Abraham and that pseudepigraphal. I find an interesting topic of conversation because when Jesus was talking to the Sadducees and Pharisees, when he said, "Rejoice to see my day," that's nowhere in the Old Testament. But if you read the Testament of Abraham, Abraham actually rejoices, physically rejoices at the thought of the coming Messiah. Okay. And so Jesus actually quoted, not directly saying this came from the Testament of Abraham, but nonetheless, Jesus was aware of that story of Abraham rejoicing for the coming Messiah, and that is in the Testament. So I find that really.
Have you seen that?
I have. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Isaiah scroll being the only intact copy, I think. That can go either way. The way they did things back in antiquity was whatever book was cherished the most was copied the most, like a favorite, right? Like a favorite movie, everybody would have a copy of that favorite movie, right?
Right.
So the Isaiah scroll, I believe, this is what I believe, that intact scroll, I believe, would have been cherished above all the other scrolls, and I believe that to be the main scroll that all the other scrolls were copied from.
And I believe
that's what I think.
I think that's really an interesting point. That of all of the books, Isaiah is the only one that's
right.
Cool.
Right, and it was also the one that was copied the most times.
Okay.
The second one, a close second, was the Book of Enoch.
Why do you think that is?
Enoch. There are some people who will say that Enoch was actually an orally transmitted story through generation. just like the Testament of Abraham was an oral story, and like everything was done orally back then. It was actually forbidden to be written down. At a certain point in time, a high priest decided to go ahead and write all these things down. And it's also important to note that no New Testament scripture was found at the Dead Sea Scrolls for obvious, reasons. Right. I mean, we're talking BC. You know what I mean? And let's see. One interesting thing I find about the Essenes is that there were other scrolls that were part of the catalog there.
Mhm.
Only about half of the scrolls that were found were biblical text. The rest of them was written by the Essenes, talking about their day-to-day life. You mentioned the community rule. That's absolutely right, kind of their day-to-day operations. But they had a couple other scrolls that were very interesting. One that they had was the war scroll. And the war scroll was an apocalyptic scroll that talked about a final battle between good and evil, the sons of light versus the sons of darkness.
Yeah.
And they considered themselves to be those sons of light. Because remember, they rejected the high priest, not only their claim because of they're not Levites, they're not part of the Levitical line, they rejected their claim, and they also rejected several of their interpretations of the law, right? Which is why they broke off and did their own thing. But one interesting thing is that in the war scroll, if you put, and I challenge everyone watching this to do this, if you take the war scroll next to Revelation, I mean, it's impossible to say that John didn't know about the war scroll. It's impossible. I mean, everything from the 7 stages of the war, right? To the sons of light defeating darkness. And another interesting thing is they had a scroll called the Melchizedek scroll. And I think if you want to look that up, it's called 11Q MELCH, if people want to Google that and look that up. But it's very interesting, and it actually says that Melchizedek at sometimes is given like a divine name, right? Like attributed to God himself, kind of like the angel of the Lord. Some would argue Jesus, and things like that. But I find that very interesting because that's the only writing we have other than Enoch speaking about Melchizedek, other than Genesis, because the book of Enoch talks about the origins of Melchizedek and where he was at, where he was placed in the garden. I just find that interesting that wasn't part of the biblical canon. I think we should do a show on the Council of Nicaea and the biblical canon controversy. I think that would be an awesome show. But anyways, and there's lots of similarities. Like if you go to Luke 16:18, it talks about the sons of light, right? The sons of light. We are children of light. We are sons of light. They also speak about it in John 12:36 and verse 50 of John 12:36 and John 12:50. So it's a good correlation between, I believe. I mean, I got lots of examples of how the disciples, not only in their letters but in their day-to-day life, how they were very, very similar with the Essene movement. And we know that Jesus was very close to John the Baptist, and I know we touched on this last show about John possibly being a member of the Essenes, which I lean more toward that way than the other way.
What did you say, Luke? What?
Luke 16:18.
18.
Yeah. So Luke 16:18 actually says, you going to pull that up?
Yeah, I'm going to pull it up.
Okay. Whoever, that's not it. Oh, yeah, no, that's right. I'm sorry. Another big, you can leave that for a minute if you would. Another big thing about the Essenes was that not a lot of the men married, right? And some of them did. But the majority of the Essenes did not marry, and a lot of biblical scholars argue that the reason why was because they were actually thinking they were in the last days. They were ready, kind of like how Paul is an apocalyptic guy too, thought that everything was going to happen now, didn't marry. But if you read that, it says whoever divorces his wife and commits adultery, whoever marries her, divorces her, and commits adultery. Okay, I don't know why I brought that up, other than maybe it was just to jog my memory of why they got divorced and why they wouldn't remarry, because they thought the end time was near.
Well, you said something about the sons of light.
Yeah, go to 1 Thessalonians 5:5.
Okay. 5:5.
Yeah, 5:5 through 11. What's that's Mohicans?
It'll find it.
Yeah.
They'll find it.
Oh no. Oh, well, either.
No.
So, but I would just put in 1 Thessalonians 5 and read the whole. It'll bring up the whole chapter, and we can scroll down. But it's very interesting, and Jesus also talks about the sons of light. The sons of light's also mentioned in Revelation by John. So 5:5 through 11. You are sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do. Let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But let us who of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love as a helmet of the hope of salvation. That kind of sounds like Ephesians talking about the armor of God.
Yeah.
But I find that interesting. Like these sons of the first mentions you have of sons of light was 400 years before the New Testament, before Paul even started writing, right? So I find that interesting that they saw themselves as the sons of light. They were also getting ready for a battle between good and evil. Melchizedek was going to be like a archangel Michael figure leading the heavenly army. That's in the Melchizedek scroll. It's 11Q MLCH. But it's very, very. I mean, you'd be silly not to put the two side by side and be like, okay. So I'm not saying that John and all those guys who wrote their Gospels, Luke or anybody, I'm not saying that they had the Qumran documents in their hands, right? Or a copy of the Qumran documents. But nonetheless, that was of the oral tradition that was passed down through the generations. Everybody was aware of it. Everybody knew what the Sons of Light was, right? So, and to me, it just
I would agree with that. Yeah.
To me, it adds credence and it adds validity to the Essene movement, because if you really study the Essene documents, well, not so much the biblical documents, but the war scroll, the Melchizedek scroll, the community rule, if you really looked at who they were and what they believed, it's very similar to the Apostolic Fathers. Very similar. And Paul, absolutely. I mean, Paul screams Essenian movement to me.
Right.
Not married, traveling here to there, speaking the truth against, standing up against a man, so to speak.
Right.
And saying you're wrong, you're wrong. So you got anything to add or any questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think just from a macro level, kind of backing up just to the discovery of the scrolls themselves, I think it's awesome how, you hear people talk about like synchronicities. And I think it's absolutely fascinating and awesome that a series of events came to fruition, which brought these to our attention. And without these, who knows where our level of education would be on it. And
that's the most important takeaway from it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what are the odds that
it was an accident?
Right, and these things were hidden for a reason.
They were an accident.
They were hidden for a reason, and that's what I was getting at. They were found for a reason.
Exactly.
But,
and it makes me wonder also, who was it that was quaking in their boots at the discovery of these things? Like there's obviously these things are controversial, and
they are.
Information is power, and so in a world that seems to be, at least until very, very recently, seemed to be going down a path of atheism and unbelief. Out of everything that can happen, these things are discovered and help people like myself, who until very recently had only like a history level of knowledge about these kind of things. It's just fascinating to see the impact that they've had. And
absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Who would have been shaking in their boots? We're going to get into some dark side of the scrolls here in a minute. I don't want to go down too many conspiracy theories, but we'll just try to stick with the facts that we do have. It's important to note that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not all written in one language, right? There were multiple languages. And there are several reasons that could be, but I would like it to be. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, but I would like it to mean that they were spreading this news to people who weren't part of the Jewish sect, who weren't part of the Jewish people. why else would they have a copy of something in another language where that language doesn't even believe, like you've got some Greek manuscripts there. I don't know if it was Koine or if it was classical Greek. I also would like to do a show on classical Greek and Koine Greek and what those two terms mean. We can get into that sometime. But back to who was quaking in their boots. One thing that I didn't speak on the last two shows and that you didn't speak on, and that was an awesome introduction, by the way. That was right on. But to add, I would add a caveat to that, being that the Catholic Church. So let me start over. So you have the Bedouins finding it, right? They sold it, and some fragments were sold for $20, $50, whatever it was. And then once somebody came in and seen it, and then when they started making noise, and they got an actual archaeological dig to go there and find it, they found a lot of scrolls. I mean, it's up in the thousands. I don't know what number you said, but I know that
It said about 900 like scrolls, but like it's the fragment.
The fragments, right?
That's it.
Right. Well, the fragments, to me,
40,000. Like
that's just as important as like if you find a fragment of a scroll. To me, that's just the same as finding an intact scroll. Because if you've got Matthew, or if you've got let's just say Isaiah 53, a small little fragment of Isaiah 53 here. I mean, who cares if this is a whole scroll? I mean, which is awesome that it's a whole scroll.
Yeah, right.
But nonetheless, that little fragment came from somewhere.
Yeah.
And when they can read it and tell that this came from a copy of Isaiah. So to me, the fragments are just as important if you can label, if you can compare them.
It's further vindication.
100%.
Vindication
100%.
Of the text being
100%.
for the most part unaltered.
Right. And there was a lot of conspiracy around this. And a lot of noise being made because it was right when Israel was going to be becoming a state, right? Very close to that. And then the Catholic Church gets involved. Okay. Well, the Catholic Church involvement kind of coincides with everything being shut down on the market from buying these things. In an indirect way. It's not a direct link, but it's an indirect link. And we can speculate on the correlation of the two. But nonetheless, whenever he put those in the Wall Street Journal to sell those, some people bought them up. Okay, some people bought them. And then they changed hands a few times. Then other people were flying in and buying them. But once Israel became a nation state, that all stopped. The prices plummeted because people were like, so I'm going to spend $1 million on this, and Israel stakes claim to this and says these are holy relics. Now they have to come back to Israel. They would legally have the right to go and take those documents back from the people who bought them, and that put a halt on everybody buying everything. And then
that's crazy.
Yeah, right. But then you throw in, because I believe that Israel knew that the Catholic Church was going to try to get their hands in on it, and sure enough, the majority of the scrolls, they were translated at the Vatican. They were in the Vatican archives. They were closed to the public for 40 years.
I'm going to do some more research.
Yeah, people couldn't get, and I implore everyone to do the research on this. A scientist, I forget, or an archaeologist, I forget the man's name, but he actually sued the Catholic Church because they weren't releasing these documents. And then the documents, the only Dead Sea Scrolls that we have, outside of the ones that were sold to other people in private collections that were later resurfaced and bought by universities, churches, etc. But the only ones that we have are the ones the Catholic Church said, oh, yeah, okay, here's all we have. You know what I mean? Here you go.
Well, that's a tale as old as time in itself.
Right.
You see that happen a lot with Egyptian relics.
Right.
You see people like Zahid Wass.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, dude.
Controlling
that
dude
information.
And,
it
also
they have a narrative.
They have a narrative. They don't want to stray from because further validation is not in their best interest.
Right. Which I think that if we ever find if anyone ever finds any writings dated back to the time of Jesus that are at odds with the Catholic Church, like they will either be labeled as heresy or they will just be bought by the Catholic Church and thrown in a glove box or put in a box somewhere. I mean, look at the Gnostic Gospel, right? Like, I don't think that a lot of the Gnostic Gospels have a lot of validity to them, especially the Gospel of Thomas. Like, we can do a show on that too if you'd like. But some of them are interesting. The ones that I find are interesting, the Catholic Church labeled them heresy, even though 90% of what they're saying is true, but it's the 10% that go against the Catholic Church, so they just say, oh, that's wrong. You know what I mean? They kind of throw it out. But for the Dead Sea Scrolls, I just think that, in a nutshell, it was a group of people. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the biblical side of them, all they are just ancient copies
They're just
of
copies.
the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And it pushes it back, like you said, 1,000 years from the Septuagint. Right? So, and Isaiah is pretty much verbatim what it is today. That, of course, it would be right. Because that's the scroll that they would have been reading at the temple during the time of Jesus. So to me, it's not that big a deal that it would. To me, it's not that big a deal that it would be the same all the way up. What would be interesting to me is if we could find some ancient New Testament manuscripts, but we don't have that. We do have. We have the ones we have.
Right. We have the ones that we have.
We have the ones we have that's been translated into the Septuagint or into
Right.
what would it have been? Not the Septuagint was Old Testament. What's the first put together of the New Testament? Would that be? Was the Septuagint part of that? I thought Septuagint.
They used it, didn't they? They used the Septuagint that to go into.
I don't know that the Septuagint had any New Testament stuff in it at all. Actually,
No, I think it was. You're right. I think you're
Yeah.
right. I think it was only like the Old Testament Hebrew.
the 5 books of
Into Greek.
Moses.
Yeah, into Greek.
Yeah, and so, but in either way, I find it interesting that number one that they survived that long.
Right.
But it's very important to note that the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually eroding before people's eyes, even though they're being preserved and everything. Because the number one killer of scrolls is, of course, damp air and light. And
how fascinating is that? That they just, I don't know if they knew the properties of the area would be, conducive to preservation, or if it was just happenstance. Because
that's what I'm saying.
Also, when they open up like Egyptian tombs and things like that, things that are so old that as soon as the air hits them,
they vaporize pretty much. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And I think that's important to note too. I mean, we can go down a theological road. I mean, obviously we're men of faith, but I do believe that they were found for a reason.
Oh,
and I do believe that God
definitely.
that God was with the Essenian movement, and I think that proves the validity of what they're saying.
I mean, they were hidden as Israel was being destroyed, and then they were found.
But hang on,
Israel was about to be emerge as a state again.
I will push back on that because that's the mainstream narrative. What you're talking about. But what I will say is that they were in Qumran hundreds of years before Jesus was there. You know what I mean?
What I'm saying is the writing and the copying stopped. They hid them in those cliffs when the Romans were coming.
Who hid them in the cliffs?
The Essenes.
Well, I think the Essenes just always had them there in the cliffs because that was their community. They lived there.
Right. They could have had them but they had in those ruins that I was talking about in my presentation. Those ruins that was their library. That was where they were actually doing their
right.
And then that was 100 meters or so away from Cave 4.
Sure.
So when the Romans were coming, they took the ones that could escape, that weren't killed, the ones that could escape, they ran over to those caves and hid them in there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. That's a possibility. But I would also say that there's a lot of evidence that points to that library always being there, always being stocked. They were always doing scribal stuff there hundreds of years before.
Well, yeah, I'm not pushing back on that. Like that area, the ruins, that was actually their area. That was their scriptorium.
That was their community.
That's where they lived. That's all of that.
Some of them.
That was that area there.
Right.
But the cliffs, that's where they actually. I mean, they just went and they hit them in there real quick, thinking that they were going to come back to it.
Sure, I mean that makes sense.
If they survived this attack from the Romans, they were just going to go back.
That could be, but I find it interesting that
so I don't think they ever had a chance to go back.
Well, of course not. Yeah. I don't think that it mattered. I don't think that it mattered. To me personally, I don't think that it mattered because their Messiah had already arrived. I don't think that mattered to them. You know what I mean? Like, okay, who cares about all this? Just like the Jews who follow Jesus, who cares about all this stuff we've been taught? We have the Messiah now, and he teaches a different thing. Well, kind of a different thing. But actually, if you want to be honest, all Jesus taught was Old Testament.
Yeah.
To be honest,
I have
yeah,
a question.
sure.
When it comes to the discovery of the scrolls and them being in the possession of the Vatican for so long, is there anything that seems to be missing?
They don't know. They don't know.
So
Like we don't know. Yeah, I mean we don't.
Context.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know. And I would like to. I'll probably do some research on this, and we can caveat toward this on another show, just briefly if you like.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is,
Because I'm going to do some more research.
Okay.
As well.
But what I would like to find out is the Book of Enoch, right? The Book of Melchizedek, the War Scroll. I would like to know, were these original documents purchased by the Vatican and then re-released by the Vatican, or were these some of the ones that were kind of sold under the nose of everybody and then resurfaced? I think it'd be interesting to find, because to me, because I would like to find out if the War Scroll, the Community Rule, the Book of Enoch, the old book, Isaiah is harmless to Christian or to the Catholic Church, but the Sons of Light, all of these things, I would like to know if the War Scroll and the Community Rule were some of the documents that were purchased by the Vatican Church or brought to the Vatican Church and then released by the Vatican Church, or were these documents part of the collective trove that was sold privately before the Catholic Church got involved? Because I think it'd be interesting to see if because the War Scroll puts a big dirty finger right in the Catholic Church, saying all these things that you're claiming to be you the originator of, these guys were saying this 300 years before Jesus was born. So I think that would be an interesting to kind of see how those things surface, how those things got brought to be. But as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls, my closing statements on it would be, it's awesome that we have that. It's like you said, it basically proves that the Old Testament has been preserved really well over the years. Maybe not over the years, but at least from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Septuagint, they were spot on. So we know that those are the scrolls that the priest was reading in the temple. Right. We know we got the same Old Testament they had. Well, I don't know, the Jews kind of take out Isaiah 53. Don't let their people read that. But anyway, that's for another show. But I think it's really, really cool. I don't think Ben Shapiro is going to come join the show anytime soon.
Well, you never know.
But I think it's just really cool that we can trace this stuff all the way back there. But it's also important to put out there, these only go back to 300 BC. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that's the oldest date that they have. So some of them could have been written in between there and the birth of Christ, or destruction of the temple, like you were saying, somewhere in that time period. But I would love to find something else. I would love to find, because if we have a common scroll that we can unroll that's that old, if it was done again on something else, we know that would survive, because skeptics and atheist biblical scholarship will tell, and rightfully so, if you're looking at it through an academic lens. I'm not going to rag on the academics, because we have belief they don't. But what I will say is they do have a leg to stand on when the oldest copies that we have of our Bible only go back to 300 AD. You know what I mean? Those are the oldest copies we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we know that Abraham was 2000 BC,
Yeah, but okay.
Yeah.
I get that, but what about all these other texts that are like secular texts and stuff like that don't even compare to the Bible, that they don't have copies that go
but yet they consider them scholarship.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm with you on that. But I'm looking at it from an objective lens of saying, okay, because I'm a believer. And you got someone like Dan McClellan, who ironically enough is a believer. You know what I'm saying? He is a member of the LDS, the Latter-day Saints. He does believe Jesus was the Messiah. You know what I mean? He's a Mormon. He does believe all of that. But I don't want to plug him too much. But anyways, I do watch a lot of his stuff, not because I believe in him, but because I try to wrap my head around, well, what could we put in front of you to make you believe that? You know what I mean? Even if you had something that could be somehow pinned back to the ark, like a copy of Enoch that's on a tree bark or something done by Woody the Woodpecker or something. You know what I mean? Something like, even if we show them that, they would be like, oh yeah, well that's just proof that it was written back then. That doesn't mean it happened. You see what I'm saying? So they always have.
I mean,
they're
always gonna move the goalposts.
Right, 100%.
Every single
That's
time.
a good way to put it.
You give them what they're asking for, and then they'll just ask for
Right.
something.
Like, what would you believe? You know what I mean? I think John Lennox had a really good exchange with an atheist. I love John Lennox. He's got his doctorate of mathematics from Oxford. He's a Christian. He's always going against atheists.
And that's all you have to do with them is just ask, well, what will you take? What
right.
will you accept?
And that's what he said. And then some guy said, well, I guess if Jesus came to me and said, do this, do that, do this, you're a believer. And then he responded back by saying, well, wouldn't you just say you were hallucinating? You know what I mean? So, but because it paints them into a corner, because we were talking about Church Latter-day Saints briefly. Look at John Smith. He claims that he had a revelation. Mm-hmm. The same way that John had a revelation. The same way that Peter's gospel came to him by revelation. And what Peter didn't have the disciples to learn from. Paul didn't have the disciples to learn from. That's why Paul's gospel is different from the 12 disciples. Mm-hmm. Paul's gospel was given to him from Jesus directly, right? His revelation. And Paul actually calls it my gospel was given to me by divine revelation. Anyone who teaches other than my gospel is teaching false doctrine, which is another show we could do, getting into how those guys were at odds with each other on certain things.
On certain things. Not a lot, but
it was a lot.
James the Elder,
it was a lot.
And Paul, they had their little
and Peter,
Peter. I get it.
But the only reason why they had a big schism, but the only reason why it all works now is because the disciples relented and gave Paul the leadership. They're like, okay, fine, we're going to do it your way. You know what I mean? Even though James was the leader of the church, which he's never mentioned hardly at all as the leader. But anyways, that's all I have, James. If you have anything you'd like to add, or
no, I think this was a really, really good 2-part series that we had. The Dead Sea Scrolls are actually like I said before, one of the greatest discoveries of all time.
Agreed.
And if not our modern history. So much was found, and yes, there's a lot. I'm saying so much was found and so little. I mean, we now can trust our Bible, and to a different degree than we've trusted it before. So, hey, you have anything then?
I would just say that there are a million reasons why it's an exciting time to be alive.
Sure.
Right now, we're seeing so many things in so many areas coming to light. Mm-hmm. With new technology, with new ways of dispensing information. It's such an exciting time to be alive.
Yes, sir.
And it makes me wonder what's out there that's waiting to be discovered.
Sure.
And I'm really excited to see where this is going, and it's a really exciting time to be alive.
Mm-hmm. The fullness of time.
That's right. And then I would just add one thing to what you said. You're absolutely right. It does prove that the Old Testament is pretty much verbatim from back then, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Old Testament that we have today, which is basically just the Jewish Bible, right? That's called what it is. The Hebrew Bible. But
like you were saying about skeptics too, so much of what we believe in is reliant on faith. Mm-hmm. And we can have a lot of documentation or archaeological sites that can be found that help prove our beliefs. But at a certain point, it's about faith.
That's right.
You can't force anybody to.
That's very good.
To be faithful.
Right. Very good.
Right.
It's not proof that makes us believe.
Right.
Okay. It's faith. By faith, Abraham was justified and was the father of nations. So with that, James, I'll kick it over to you to close. And thank you guys very much.
Thank you much. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Share this stream. Share some of the other content found on the channel. And always remember, Jesus loves you. Thank you for joining us.
God bless everyone.
God bless.